So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Trauma and Literature. We have already begun looking at Joseph Heller's novel Catch-22. So we started with the novel, the text in the previous session. We'll just continue from where we left off last time. So this should be on your screen. So we were talking about how the opening of the novel is set in a hospital ward, a military hospital ward. And the protagonist, Wasarain, is obviously an inhabitant in the hospital, and there's a comic quality to it. There's a comic quality to the entire characterization, and also in the way that, the sense of humor is quite morbid in quality, because there are people dying, coming in, dying, and obviously people with pain. They're suffering people, suffering subjects, but the way they're represented is quite comic in quality, and the comicality of it actually accentuates the trauma of it rather than undercutting it. So as we mentioned at the beginning of this novel, that this is a very different take on trauma, a very different perspective on trauma. So it gives you a dark comic quality, and that sort of makes it more nihilistic as well. It empties out any possibility of tragedy, empties out or exhausts any possibility of tragedy. So even the grandeur of tragedy, the poetry of tragedy, the substance of tragedy is denied to these people. They're so traumatized in a numbed sense. So, and we talked about the quality of farce over here, how this is actually a farcical representation rather than a tragic representation. And, paradoxically, therein lies the tragedy of it. It's not even tragic. It's become farcical. So, Wasarain is obviously the character here, and he is, we sort of see these actions through his eyes. So he's a focal character, the focal point, and we get to know now. We'll read this in a bit, that how his job in a hospital is to censor letters, right? So letters which are sent by the soldiers in the hospital to the families. He's supposed to censor those, look at the content, and blacken out or scratch out anything which is objectionable or confidential or classified information. So that was his job. So it sounds quite serious. It sounds like an intelligence officer duty, but then we get to know very quickly that how he's making up, again, a farce out of it. So farce and paradox, these are the two very recursive tropes in the entire novel. These keep coming back. So these are instruments of narration, instruments of representation used by the novelist Heller, and in terms of looking at a situation of human suffering, which is very tragic, very political in quality, the Second World War. But then the way it's represented is almost through morbid humor, through gallows humor. So that's what I meant when I said that there's a very interesting proximity to death over here, right? It's a humor and death, a humor and hollowness. So these are almost connected categories over here. So the hollowness of these people, the fact that they cannot really feel sad anymore, it just becomes so repetitive. It just becomes a part of the daily routine that the shock of suffering goes away. And suffering becomes the daily condition, a repetitive ritual. And in that sense, it becomes farcical in quality, almost domestic in quality, intimate in quality, right? So, and that's what I mentioned when I say that suffering is not really tragic anymore, because there should be a shock component in tragedy, something which unsettles you, something which moves you, makes you emotionally moved. But then these are people who suffer at such a daily level. It's like a ritual of suffering that they exhaust all possibility of tragedy in that sense. So here we have this section where Wasarain is supposed to censor the letters, and we will get to know how he does it. Again, a very farcical representation, and this should be on your screen. All the officer patients in the ward were forced to censor letters written by all the enlisted men patients who are kept in residence in wards of their own. It was a monotonous job, and Wasarain was disappointed to learn that the lives of enlisted men were only slightly more interesting than the lives of officers. After the first day, he had no curiosity at all. To break the monotony, he invented games. Death to all modifiers, he declared one day. And out of every letter that passed through his hands went every adverb and every adjective. The next day he made war on articles. He reached a much higher plane of creativity the following day, when he blacked out everything in the letters but a, an, and the. That erected more dynamic interlinear tensions, he felt. and in just about every case left a message far more universal. Soon he was prescribing parts of salutations and signatures and leaving the text untouched. So one time he blacked out all but the salutation, "Dear Mary," from a letter, and at the bottom he wrote, "I yearn for you tragically, R.O. Shipman, chaplain, U.S. Army." R.O. Shipman was a group chaplain's name. So what we see over here is again some kind of a parody, some satire, and obviously a trivialization, of something which is supposed to be very human in quality. So these are suffering, sick soldiers sending letters to their families, to their beloved, to their people they are connected to. And here we have a man, obviously very cynical, very humorous in a dark, comic way. And his job is to censor his letters. So what does it do? He cuts out, scratches out words randomly. So certain days he gets rid of all adjectives, all adverbs. On certain other days he gets rid of all articles, a and the. And there are certain days where he just gets rid of all signatures. So the text goes untouched and he just adds signatures to it. So again, the signatures could be completely fictional in quality. So he writes fictional names of people. So what this does in a very tragicomic way, again, is to create some kind of a playful atmosphere, a playful politics, the politics of play. And play over here is not really an innocent activity. Play over here is some kind of a self-preservation technique, right? So there's a ludic quality, L-U-D-I-C, ludic meaning playful. There's a dark ludic quality to this, which is the only ritual that he can invent to give some kind of meaning. And again, you can think of some other representations of trauma, horror, which incorporate this ludic quality, this playful quality. So, for example, you can think of certain films which have this, Holocaust films which have this ludic quality, where prisoners in a concentration camp, they're inventing games in terms of how they can pass time, but also give some kind of a fantasy structure around their condition. Right, so these are little rituals that human beings make, in certain situations of horror and terror and trauma, and we have a similar setting over here. So here is a person who's just there, malingering, feigning to be sick, but actually in a hospital ward during the military, in a military hospital ward during the war, and he's just randomly blackening out letters, inserting signatures, getting rid of certain words, certain adjectives, depending on his whim. So there is a perverse godlike quality that Wasserine has, and he's just someone who decides what should go out and what should not go out in terms of the censoring of letters. And obviously, if you think about it in an emotional way, these are letters which will reach certain people, and those are people who are very eager to learn how the soldiers are, how their relatives are in the hospital ward. And here is a man who is just playing a playful god, in his trauma ward of the hospital, and just getting rid of certain words, certain letters, certain signatures at whim, right? So the whimsicality of it is what we are trying to underline over here, and that again connects to the absurdity of this existence, right? The absurdity of these rituals, which in turn connects to the broader absurdity of the war, right? So what it is reflective of essentially and symbolically is the absurdity of the spectacle of war, the spectacle of suffering, which is caused by the Second World War. So that's the reason why we need to take this, trivial sections, playful sections, flippant sections very seriously, because the tragedy or the suffering lies in the flippancy, right, in the flippant representation of it. So it's not really any grandeur to it. So it's not really writing poetry about the suffering anymore. That has sort of debased into or degenerated into this kind of flippant ritual of scratching out letters, blackening out certain signs, inserting certain signatures. So the flippancy of it is a pointer to the mental state over here, the traumatic state over here. So it's so numbed, so bored really by trauma, so bombarded by trauma as a daily ritual that there's nothing that can shock him in terms of creating something emotional out of it. So he just needs to pass time. And like you said, there is a there's a perverse godlike quality to this, right? And he's like squatting flies, as it were, and getting rid of letters. So the textuality of it is also important, because we're literally looking at text which conveys certain messages, and he's just there controlling the text, controlling the flow of text from this hospital ward. But again, it's a very flippant flow. He makes sure that the flow of text becomes flippant in quality, becomes comic in quality, and a comicality and flippancy, again, like I said, are pointers to the mental state of this particular person. Right, so it's an important passage in terms of what he's doing with the letters. The textual play, the sign play are important because, again, these come out of boredom, these come out of a ritual that he's invented to pass time. And again, this creation of a playfulness is something that he is doing deliberately in order to have some kind of a self-preservation technique. And then he comes to the next passage, and the key word in the passage here is exhausted, right? If you can take a look, when he had exhausted all possibilities in the letters, he began attacking the names and addresses on the envelopes, right? Obliterating whole names and streets, and highlighting entire metropolises with careless flicks of his wrist as though he were God, right? So the first sentence obviously is quite indicative. So he's just getting rid of addresses, getting rid of street names, and entire cities have been scratched out, obliterating whole homes as though he were God. So it's like a textual God in a certain sense. He controls the text, he controls information, he controls what goes out, he controls the semiotic play emerging out of this hospital ward. And again, there is this flippant quality to it, but the flippancy is exactly reflective of his state, the condition that he is in. Catch-22 required that each censored letter bear the censoring officer's name. So Catch-22 is a name given to this program, this exercise of censoring letters. And it entailed that the person who was censoring it should write the name in the bottom of each letter. So Wasserman was supposed to write the name of himself. Most letters he didn't read at all. On those he didn't read at all, he wrote his own name. On those he did read, he wrote Washington Irving. So Washington Irving is obviously the name of the very significant American cultural figure, and he would write that name, Washington Irving, on the letters that he had read. When that grew monotonous, he wrote Irving Washington, sort of changed the sequence. Censoring the envelopes had serious repercussions, produced a ripple of anxiety on some ethereal military echelon that floated a CID man back into the world posing as a patient. They all knew he was a CID man because he kept inquiring about an officer named Irving or Washington, and because after his first day he wouldn't censor letters. He found them too monotonous. Right, so again, we find the production of paradoxes over here very, very interesting. That he just takes us in a very flippant way. He scratches out entire names, addresses, blackens out street names, blackens out city names. In other words, he's destroying the letters. He's decimating the information in those letters, and he's supposed to do just the opposite. Now, also, we can find how there's a dwindling of everything over here. He writes the name of Washington Irving, a major literary cultural figure, an iconic figure in American imagination. And the fact that he's writing the name after the end of such comic exercise, it just dwindles entire American cultural imaginary over here. So again, the point is making everything flippant, is making everything into a sort of into some kind of a mockery of existence. So everything has been brought down and mocked at, and therein lies the deconstruction over here, that everything becomes a playful activity, tragedy becomes a playful activity, tragedy becomes a semiotic activity, it just becomes a play of science, and like I mentioned, that there is always this very close proximity to death, right? So it's all about death. There are people dying in this world, but the way it's represented, it almost has some kind of a morbid humor about it. And then we have an intelligence officer coming in to inquire about who is Washington Irving or Irving Washington, and then Wasserman stops writing letters because he finds them too monotonous. Okay, so the first two passages over here are very, very clearly indicative of the comic quality and the sort of dark comic quality to the suffering, and how that becomes the only quality available, the only existence available. And that is important because, in a way that connects to the mental state of these people, that they cannot be tragic, they cannot be profound or deep or have any grandeur of existence, because all that's denied to them, right? All that is still taken away from them because of the dailiness of horror, the dailiness of suffering. So suffering becomes like a routine for them, and they invent this fantasy games, this playful games, this comic games, in order to have some sense of sustenance, right? So that becomes important. It was a good ward this time, one of the best that he and Dunbar had ever enjoyed. With them, this time, there was a 24-year-old fighter pilot captain with a sparse golden moustache who had been shot in the Adriatic Sea in midwinter and not even caught cold. Now, again, this is a classic paradox over here. So we have a captain, a fighter pilot captain, who was in this hospital, who had been shot down in the Adriatic Sea. So obviously that connotes or implies all kinds of tragedy. Someone had been shot down, someone had been bombed and fell in the sea. But then the next part of the sentence just makes it comic. It said that despite being shot down, despite having fallen into the Adriatic Sea in midwinter, he did not catch cold. Right? And this juxtaposition of horror and comicality makes Catch-22 a really a cognitively complex novel, right? Because it's not really about tragedy, although the content is very tragic, the content is very serious, the content is about human suffering, but the form and the representation have a playful quality to it, and that playfulness, the comicality, is exactly what makes the novel very postmodern in quality, and also, in a certain sense, post-structuralist. And the reason why we are doing this right after Malibu is because if you look at Malibu's model of trauma, there's a very post-structuralist, Derridan quality about trauma in Malibu. And then you come to something like this, which has a sense of cognitive flatness. These are people who are seemingly incapable of experiencing tragedy or experiencing any sadness. So all they can have is some kind of a hollow humor. The hollowness of the humor, the superficiality of the humor is important for us to understand and underline. Okay, so this is a captain, a fighter pilot captain who had been shot and fell in the Adriatic Sea in midwinter and did not catch cold. Now the summer was upon them. The captain had not been shot down, and he said he had the gripe. In the bed on Wasserain's right, still lying amorously on his belly, was the startled captain with malaria in his blood and a mosquito bite on his ass. So again, if you look at the words chosen over here, they're almost vulgar in quality, and also the word amorously is interesting because that's the last word you would associate in a hospital ward. Amorous is romantic, playful, erotic, right? Still lying amorously on his belly was a startled captain with malaria in his blood, right? So malaria in his blood, and malaria is like a tropical disease, but it's not really something which relates to war. It's not really a grand war disease. So if you take a look at the references to disease over here, cold, gripe, malaria, there seems to be some kind of flattening of the entire tragedy of war, again, to the choice of disease, the reference of disease, right? So these are diseases which don't quite have the glamorous connotation of war, right? Across the aisle from Wasserain was Dunbar. Next to Dunbar was the artillery captain, with whom Wasserain had stopped playing chess. So again, if you take a look at the characterization and definitions over here, people are introduced through negations, right? So this is a person that is described over here. And how was introduced? He's someone with whom Wasserain had stopped playing chess. So again, definition through absence, description through absence, description through negation, which is again part of the production of paradoxes in a novel, right? So it's a very paradoxical representational mode that has been employed over here. So this definition, description through negation is a very classic trope for that kind of representation. The captain, so why did he stop playing chess? The captain was a good chess player, and the games were always interesting. So again, we are sort of beginning to think, why was the game stopped? Because he was a good player, the games were interesting. Wasserain had stopped playing chess with him because the games were so interesting. They were foolish, right? So interesting, again, we can see some kind of a deconstruction at work over here, a complete reversal of logic, shall we say. And this is exactly what I meant at the beginning when we had this introductory session on the novel, that there is a dark carnivalesque quality about this novel where the theoretical, notional, logical parameters are inverted and reversed, right? So someone has to stop playing chess. Why? Because the games were very interesting. And why is that a problem? Because the games were interesting, they were foolish. There's no drama. They know exactly how to play the game, they know all the rules, and as a result of which the games become foolish, right? So there's no creativity as such. There's no drama as such. And then there was the educated Texan from Texas. Again, there seems to be some kind of a satire over here. Educated Texan, the connotation is, it's like a rare thing. Educated Texan from Texas, who looked like someone in Technicolor, right? So Technicolor being this movie production house, and felt patriotically that people of means, decent folk, should be given more votes than drifters, hordes, criminals, degenerates, thieves, and indecent folk, people without means, right? So again, we can see some kind of a smuggled political message over here. This is a person from Texas and who thinks that people with means, and who are people with means? People with capital, with money, and they are the decent people by default. And they're the patriotic people by default. They should be given more votes. So all these people should have the ability to get more than one vote, as it were, than compared to people without means. So who are the people without means? Who are the non-voters? Who should be the non-voters? Drifters, whores, criminals, degenerates, thieves, and indecent folks. Right. So again, we have a very conservative Christian picture over here, which is obviously parodied and satirized. So this is a person from Texas, an educated Texan who feels this way. So obviously there's a satire on certain kind of political and religious and cultural standpoint which is being conveyed over here. So these are people without means. So they are people who should be denied the voting ability, and that ability should go only to people with means who happen to be the patriotic people. So I stop at this point today, but we can see how the novel begins to smuggle in some very subversive messages, some very subversive political messages in a very flippant way. It's like a complete comical world where the messages just come in a very superficial way, and the superficiality in the novel and the flippancy in the novel are very deliberate narrative strategies, very deliberate novelistic strategies, because this is exactly what makes the novel more complex in quality, more cognitively complex, more politically complex, more culturally complex. So that's the reason why it is such an important cultural artifact, this novel, Catch-22. It's become some kind of metaphor in popular imagination. So Catch-22 means a dilemma, a moral dilemma, to do or not to do, to go or not to go, to act or not to act. But then again, we see how that the profundity of that moral dilemma is satirized and deconstructed and played so frequently in the novel. The very opening suggests that does he have a jaundice or does he not have a jaundice? So don't quite know. That's the reason why he's in a limbo state in a hospital. He can't be treated and he can't be let go. So there's a funny quality to it, and that makes it more serious in a certain way, right? There's no heavy-handed moral message. There's no heavy-handed religious or cultural or political message, and the sort of avoidance of any heavy-handedness and the appropriation of a flippant frame is exactly what makes the novel a very complex literary experiment, which has attained the status of a classic in modern times. So I stop at this point today. I will continue with this. I will begin to look at some selected passages from this point from the next session. Thank you for your attention.